Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Tzadi Gimel. Today on Yom HaShoah we dedicate our learning in memory of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Today's daf is sponsored by Caroline Ben Ari in loving memory of her father Ivor Rhodes, Yisrael Ben Meir V'Sara, on his 16th year at site. Dad, I can't believe it's been 16 years. You epitomize the H. Jackson Brown Jr. quote. Live so that when your children think of fairness, caring, and integrity, they think of you. I do my best to live up to your example, especially when it comes to your fondness for really bad puns. Okay, we're going to get started today. We have a study guide, and I'll share my screen here and there, which both has some organization of some of the sugya and also has some extra sources that we're going to bring in here and there for small additions. We really dealt yesterday with semicha, and particularly the elements of which communal korbanot have semicha, which we said only 2, and there was a debate which 2. Then we moved on to the individual sacrifice. The individual sacrifices need semicha. And then we said that except for Bechor, Ma'aser, and Pesach, we had a drasha in order to say, it says korbanot 3 times. That one is going to exclude each of these 3, to which the Gemara said, you don't really need that to exclude those 3, because there's no reason to have thought that just because it's by shlamim, which has all sorts of unique halachot, that it would also be in these korbanot. And therefore, you don't even need the psukim. We ended with saying the psukim are really just asmachta ba'alma, to which the Gemara asked, the very last word of tzadi bet and mubet, ela krai lamali. So what do we need the psukim for? And I'm already going to start sharing my screen, and you're going to see that we're going to have a lot of different, or at least a few different possibilities of how to darshan this pasuk. But not right now. Right now, we're just going to suggest one, and later in the next sugya, we're going to come back to this. So right now we're just doing the first part of this chart, which is we had originally the first rasha was korbanot and not the bechor, korbanot not the maaser, korbanot not the pesach. Then they say, okay, but we don't really need the psukim for that. So what really are these 3 korbanos? Why did it have to say your korban? Which, by the way, in the first explanation, it was more your korban and not meaning yours as an optional, something you opted into rather than all sorts of obligatory ones. The second way of darshaning it's going to be different, which is focused on something else in the word korbano, as opposed to saying yours because you volunteered to do it. It's going to be yours because it's yours personally and not, okay, ela krai lamali. What do we need these psukim for? Korbano velo korban chavero, your korban and not your friend's korban, meaning you can't do smicha on someone else's korban. Korbano velo korban ove kochavim, not a Gentile's. Korbano, okay, that they're not, right? Now this is kind of similar. If you can't do it for your friends, you also can't do it for a Gentile sacrifice. So we'll see later, but right now they seem to be 2 different things. And korbano l'rabot, this one actually comes to include, well, it is your korban, which means l'rabot kol ba'alei korban l'smicha. If a bunch of us went together and said, we're going to together bring a korban ola, let's say, so each one of us individually has to do smicha. Okay, so the first 2 are limiting, and the second one is including, because it's your korban. So it's your korban means everybody whose korban it is has to be part of it. Okay, so that's right now, and we're going to leave this chart right now, but we're going to come back to it in the next sugya. So the next sugya starts out very strange, because we saw in the Mishna, if you remember, hayoresh somech umevi nesachim umemio. So an heir inherits a korban, okay, the father or mother dies, they have a sacrifice they were planning to bring, the animal's already there. So they do smicha on the korban. If they need to, they bring libations with it also, they're obligated to bring the libations, and they do temura. Well, they don't really do temura. What does it mean? It means that the pasuk of if you do temura, so first of all, you're going to get lashes. It's forbidden, lo yamir, it says in the Torah. You can't do temura. You can't say, oh, you know what, I want to replace this animal, whether it's a better animal, whether it's a worse animal, you're not allowed to do that. But if you do it, you'll get lashes, and the second animal will be sanctified as well. So that's effective only if you do it for your own korban, or if you're an heir and you inherited a korban. So either which way, okay, so the yoresh somech, yoresh brings nisachim, and yoresh mimir. But now we have this person, Rav Hananya, Tane Rav Hananya, Kamei de Rava. He brought a braita in front of Rava, and he said the following: Yoresh eno somech, Yoresh eno mimir. Okay, he doesn't talk about the libations, but he basically says an heir doesn't do smicha, and an heir is not mimir. Okay, v'ha anantnan. But then Rava said, but don't we learn in the Mishna? Hayoresh somech umevi et nesachav umemir. The Yoresh is somech. The Yoresh, right? We said the exact opposite in the Mishnah. Amar le ibchai. So Rav Hanania, when he brought this braita into Rav's Beit Midrash, he said, "Oh, did I make a mistake here? And maybe I should flip it and say, oh no, it really says," because often when they memorize these braitot, they could have made mistakes with it. He said, "Oh, did I make a mistake? Is it completely the opposite? Should I switch it and say Yoresh Memir, Yoresh Somech?" Amar le lo. He says, "No." Matnitach, your braita mane. Who does it go according to? Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Tanya, as it says in a braita. Now we're going to see that what it said in our Mishnah, in another braita, it actually says it's a Tannaitic debate. And that falls into exactly right. There's Tanakama and there's Rabbi Yehuda. Tanakama matches our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda matches the braita. Tanya, Yoresh Somech, Yoresh Memir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yoresh no Somech, Yoresh no Memir. So there you have it. There's a Tannaitic debate, and that works out fine. You don't have to erase your braita, change your braita is fine. Now we want to understand what's the basis for each of these opinions. So each is going to bring a pasuk and then derive one from the other. Okay? So one's going to bring a pasuk about semicha and derive from there to temura, and the other is going to have a pasuk about temura and derive from there to semicha. Okay? And we'll see in a minute on what basis they each make the comparison. The comparison is made on the same basis. It's just a matter of which pasuk you darshan. My tamid Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow semicha or thinks that temura is ineffective for an heir, says the following. He darshans the word korbano, and now you see why we're going to eventually come back to this original pasuk that we were darshaning in the beginning, because what does korbano mean? Your own korban, velo korban aviv, and not your father's korban, meaning not a yoresh. Okay, yoresh doesn't do semicha. When it talked about semicha on korbano, it says your korban, not someone else's korban. Okay, we'll come back to this chart in a minute. But right now we're here about korbano and not your father's korban. V'yalev tchilat hekdesh misof hekdesh. So that's his source by semicha. Semicha does not apply for an heir. How do you get from there to temura? Well, we learn tchilat hekdesh. What's tchilat hekdesh? Tchilat hekdesh means causing something to be hekdesh, meaning bringing sanctity to something. So temura is actually bringing sanctity to something. It's tchilat hekdesh, because what you're doing is you're taking animal A and you're saying, I want to take animal B and replace it, right? Replace animal A with animal B. You're bringing sanctity to animal B. So it's the tchilat hekdesh. So he learns tchilat hekdesh, misof hekdesh. What's sof hekdesh? It's not exactly the end, but it's once it's already sanctified, which is semicha, right? Semicha is a much later part of the process. You've already designated your animal, right? You're about to slaughter it, and you do semicha on it. So that's already once it's already sanctified. So we're going to learn one from the other. Mas sof hekdesh, just like in sof hekdesh and semicha, yoresh no samech, the yoresh is not connected. Af tchilat hekdesh, so likewise, the beginning of hekdesh, meaning having the temura become effective, yoresh no mimir, it's not effective at all. B'Rabanan, they're going to start with the temura pasuk. They're going to say, Hamer Yamil. Okay, the pasuk goes like this. Lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiroto. Okay, this is the lo tase, the negative prohibition where you're going to get lashes for. Don't replace it, and don't. Those are two different words for replacing. Tov b'ra or ra b'tov. It doesn't matter which direction. V'im hamer yamil behema b'behema v'yahu temurato yekodesh. This pasuk talks about the two elements. Number one, don't do it. But if you do it, it's effective. Now, why does it say haber yamir in a double language? That's two words saying the same thing, basically. Every time we have a double language, it's an open field for drashot. So that it's probably coming to include something. And that's why Tanakama says this includes another case. L'rabot et hayoresh. So that includes specifically the heir, which is what we're talking about. So temura is effective also for the heir. And then yalif sof hekdesh mitchilat hekdesh. And he goes the reverse. We're going to learn the end of hekdesh from the beginning of hekdesh. Mat tchilat hekdesh yoresh memir. Just like in the beginning of the stage, to bring sanctity to an object, the yoresh can do it. So af sof hekdesh, obviously then also, when it comes to semicha later, yoresh somech. Okay, so there you have it. Now what's left to do is obvious, which is, what does each one do with the other one's pasuk? Okay, so Rabbanan, hai korbano, my avdele. So what does he do with korbano? Now this is going to be easy, because we already did this in the previous sugya. We already know what the typical drasha is. Now, when we saw those three drashot, not korban chavero, not korban ovei kochavim, and the rabot kabbalei korban l'smicha, notice the yoresh wasn't there. So very simply, right, Korbano v'lo korbano ve'kochavim, korbano v'lo korban chavero, korbano l'rabot kol ba'alei korban l'smicha. The three we had before, that's what we're going to say the rabbis say, as opposed to Rabbi Yehuda. Now we're going to have to figure out what does Rabbi Yehuda do then. He doesn't have those three drashot. So we have two possibilities to understanding Rabbi Yehuda. Either Rabbi Yehuda l'rabot kol ba'alei korban l'smicha leitle. Either, and this is why I have Rabbi Yehuda as two possibilities here. Either Rabbi Yehuda just doesn't have the last one, that all ba'alei korban, all partners in a korban have to do smicha. So he just switches that with, okay, and not the yoresh, okay, or lo korban aviv in the words that we had before. V'inami, itle, maybe he does have that. But then what could we do? And this goes back to something I said earlier in class. Oved kochavim v'chavero mechad kra nafka. You could say that lo korban chavero and lo korban oved kochavim was all learned from one mention of korbanot, because in essence they're the same thing, right? If you can't do smicha for your friend's sacrifice, then you obviously can't do smicha for a non-Jew's sacrifice. So he puts that all in one, and then iyatra lutrei krai. Then he's left with two. So chad korban v'lo korban aviv, v'idach lerabot kol ba'alei korban l'smicha. And then he has the yoresh one, right? Not the heir, not the korban of your father, and also all ba'alei korban do smicha. So it's possible he agrees with the rabbis, just sticks two together, and that leaves him one that's free and available. Okay, what's left to finish up here is Rabbi Yehuda, Hi Hamir Yamir my Avidle. Now, what does he do with the rabbis? Pasuk of Hamir Yamir to include the Yoresh. So we assume it must include something. So what does it include according to him? It's to include that women are obligated in temura as well. Okay, so if a woman does temura, she's going to get lashes, and if a woman does temura, it's going to be effective. Ditanya. Now, what you really have to explain here is, why would you think a woman wouldn't be obligated? Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. But here they say the following, and the Bright is going to tell you why you might have thought a woman's not included, which is going to raise a big question, but we'll read it anyway. Ditanya, lefisha kol ha'inyan kulo eino medaber ela belashon zachar. Well, the language of the Torah, when it talks about temura, is in the masculine. And therefore, you might have thought, okay, so because it's all in masculine language, maybe, right, how do we know that ultimately it also includes a woman? Talmud Lamal, Hamil Yamil. So because it's all written in masculine form, you might have thought that women aren't included. So that's why you need Hamir Yamir. Okay, now this is very strange. Why is this very strange? Because the whole Torah is written in masculine. And in fact, the Gemara in Masechet Temura on the first daf, Bed Amud says the following. Okay, and I brought it on the sheet so we could read it inside. It says, Tama, the reason why that women are obligated in Temura is because they're Rabbi Yikra L'Isha, because of a pasuk. So they say, that's very odd. Halo Rabbi Yikra, Hava Mina ki avda Temura lo lakya. Wait, would you have thought, if we didn't have this pasuk Hamir Yamir, would you have thought a woman's not obligated? Ha-amar, Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, v'chein Tana d'ber Rabbi Yishmael, we have this bright from the house of Rabbi Yishmael, or Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, that says, based on this pasuk, Ish o isha ki asu mikol chatot adam. That's a pasuk about the korban chatat. It says a man or a woman who does any sort of sin, it's not any sin, but certain particular sins. What do you see in this pasuk? Ish o isha, a man or a woman. Hishva katuv ish l'isha lekol onashim shebetorah. Right? Men and women are equal when it comes to punishments, right? We only have like certain mitzvot. Women aren't obligated. But of course, when it comes to, keep Shabbat, all these things, women are the same as men. So it makes no sense to have thought, just because it's written in masculine form, the whole Torah is written in masculine form. And there's not only that, but there's a special drasha that says, Isha v'shaki, asumi kol chatot ha'adam. Men and women are the same for all punishments. So of course she's going to get lashes. So why on earth do you need a pasuk? So the question is much better than the answer. The answer is not the most convincing answer, but they say the following. Temura has a unique element to it, different from all other punishments. Why? So they say, Itzrich, you need it. Why? Ma'u detemi, you might have thought, Hanemile onesh deshaveh bein biyachi bein b'tzibur. This might be only punishments that are equal to everybody, and equal to individuals, and equal to the community. Aval hacha, this is something that not everybody's obligated in. Why? If we jointly own a korban, and I decide, right? Let's say we decide together we're going to switch the animal. We're not obligated. It's only a punishment for an individual if two people or a bunch of people do it together on a korban they're all partners in, or a tzibur, there's no temura. Temura is not effective. So you might have thought that because there's some exceptions to this rule of when cases where there's no obligation of temura, maybe you would have thought isha nami ki avdalolak, and maybe women are exceptions to the rule. Kam mashmalan, that's why it comes to teach you no. Women are obligated as well. Okay, so it's not the most convincing answer, because why would you think just because the tzibur and the shutafim that we would then say the woman is exempt? But in the end, they basically say, you have to come up with some reason, because it really is, it's really kind of a complicated question why specifically they would think that women aren't obligated, that they would need a special pasuk. But sometimes also when someone's put in a corner, right, they have to answer. So what are you going to do with Hamer Yamir? So they come up with this. Oh, we'll include women as well, even if it's not the most convincing drasha. Okay, let's move on. So now we have, we just have to finish up this section now. So now Rabbanan, so where are they going to learn that women are obligated? Now they don't say, well, it's obvious, because Isha are the same for all korbanot, which you would have expected them to say. But no, it seems like even the rabbis need a pasuk to include women. Well, darshe mevi'im. In the middle of that pasuk, after it said, don't do this, then it said, and if you do it, and if vi'im, so the vi'im is to tell you that also women. Rabbi Yehuda ve'im lo darshan. Rabbi Yehuda just doesn't darshan the ve'im, and with that we finish the ping pong between them. So what we did in this section was we saw, number one, we saw this machloket. Is it yoresh somecha mimir? Is it yoresh not somecha mimir? So we saw that what appeared in our Mishna is actually a Tannaitic debate. We saw the sources for each of them, and then we went back and saw, because it connected with the previous sugya, about different possible ways of using those three korbanos to darshan it in different ways, and for that you have the chart to review. Now we get to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hakol somchim, who does semicha now? Everybody does semicha, except for, we're going to have a long list of exceptions. So first we have chutz micheresh shoteh v'katan, that's our classic. Three people, right? A cheresh is generally someone who's a deaf mute, not just deaf, but a deaf mute who's assumed that they don't have proper understanding, a shoteh and a katan. Okay, these are three people that are considered, and we'll see in the Gemara, they say people without dad, people who don't have knowledge, understanding, so they're exempt basically from most mitzvot. Bisuma v'nochari, a blind person, and a Gentile. Those are two completely different categories. Okay, we're going to see where we get all these exceptions to the rule from. V'ha'eved, v'shaliach, v'ha'isha. And a Canaanite slave, a messenger, and a woman. Okay, from here you get that women are exempt from smicha. You might remember there's a famous sugya about nashim sumchot reshut, that if women want to, they can do smicha, and there were women who wanted to, and the rabbis let them. And there was a whole question about this in terms of the whole, and this is a very central sugya about whether women are allowed to do mitzvot that they're exempt from. Okay, it's one of the central sugyot. And I will point out, so Miriam, thank you for mentioning, there was a Daf Mishalahan on this a long time ago, so you can look it up on our site. And Alana Stein-Hainshir went up today on Din and Daf, actually using this case of Nashim Somcho Reshut, and trying to discuss the idea of what does Reshut mean? What does it mean when you say Reshut? It's optional. Okay, and how does that appear in other mitzvot? She analyzes in a very good way this idea of volitional. Okay, that something's volitional, and what does that mean? And in a legal system, right, that's not usually, right, legal system is usually yes or no, right? Where does this come from, this idea of reshut? Okay, so using the semicha as an example, kind of analyze it in a very broad manner. So it's a good shir to listen to get kind of an overview of a concept that appears all over. So we have this idea now. So we're going to go through this right now, where we get the whole, each of these exemptions. So now we're going to keep on though in the Mishnah, and then we'll come back to it in the Gemara. Smicha sheirei mitzvah. Smicha is a sheirei mitzvah. What does that mean? It means it's not so important. Okay, it's not an essential part as opposed to, right, we've learned many times, the shchita, the kabbalah, the holacha, right, the zrika, that's essential part. If you didn't do smicha, it's fine, although we're going to talk about it later. Is it really fine? We'll get back to that. How do you do smicha now? Al harosh, b'shtei yadayim, on the head of the animal with two hands. Ubemakom shesumchim shochatin, in the location where you do smicha, that's where you do shchita. V'techef l'smicha shchita. And immediately after smicha, you do shchita. And that's because of the juxtaposition in the pasuk. It says, v'samachet yado, a rosh koran, and then it says, v'shachat. So they say you have to do it immediately after. The connection between those two phrases of where you do smicha, you slaughter it, and immediately after you do it, we'll talk about that soon, because if you do it immediately after, then obviously it has to be in the same place. It has to be immediate, then obviously the smicha has to be in the same place as the shchita, so we'll get back to that. Now the Gemara says, Bishlama cheireshot heva katan. So they start off with the ones that are obvious on the list as to why they're exempt from this mitzvah. Obviously, cheireshot heva katan, that I understand, the la b'nei de'ah ninu, as we said before, they're considered not b'nei de'ah. They don't have knowledge and understanding. Nochri, or whatever appears by you, by me it appears as nochri, they always have different words in different Gemaras here, but nochri nami, b'nei Yisrael somchin, ve'ein goyim somchin. Okay, so it says in the pasuk, okay, where it talks about doing smicha, it says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, v'amarta lehem, and then it says, Adam ki akriv mikem korban. This is in the very beginning of Vayikra, chapter 1, okay, the first 4 psukim. Okay, it says, speak to the Jewish people and tell them, and blah, 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 and then it gets to v'samach yado rosh ha'olah. Okay, and then it says, I'll read the whole pasuk because we're going to get back to it. Samach yado, he does smicha with his hand. We'll get back to that because we said in the Mishna 2 hands. We're going to have to figure out where we get to 2 hands. It says yado, singular. Al rosh ha'olah, the head of the olah, that's where we get on the head. V'nirtza lo lechaper alav, and then he gets atonement, okay, which is a problem because didn't we say it's shayrei mitzvah? How does he get atonement? We're going to come back to that also. So now they say, okay, first part is the whole section was said to Bnei Israel. So smicha is not for non-Jews. That's the second. So we had the cheireshot heva katan as one category, the oved kochavim we got rid of. But now, elasuma my time alo. But what about a blind person? Why doesn't a blind person do smicha? You certainly don't need vision to be able to do smicha. Blind person is considered a person with knowledge, right? So why wouldn't they do smicha? So Rav Chesed, Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, each one is going to give a different reason. Chad amar atya smicha miziknei eda. We're going to learn a gzera shava. Smicha appears by the zkenim. They do smicha on the parhalin davar shel tzibur. And it says smicha here. So we're going to say, who's ziknei eda? The Sanhedrin. You can't be a judge on the Sanhedrin if you're blind. Okay, why is that? So I'll go back to the study guide. I brought 2 sources to talk about why you can't do that. Why you can't be a judge if you're blind. 2 completely different answers, and that's why it's interesting. So one in Sanhedrin Lamed Amabed, it says, Hayav Meir Omer, Matamud Lamar Al Pihem Yekol Li V'chonega. This is on the mouth, by the mouth of the court will be will be decided every riv, every argument, and every nega. What's nega? Parsha that's coming up, mitzora. Okay, leprosy is going to be determined. Why are these 2 things next to each other? What does one have to do with the other? Right? Leprosy, you wouldn't necessarily think to connect with arguments between 2 people. Ela makish rivim l'negaim. Okay, we make a hekesh. And I skipped some here, but here's the important part for our purposes. Ma negaim shelo b'sumin. Now, the Kohen determines when you have a nega. Now, how does the Kohen determine? He looks at it. To what the Kohen can see. The Kohen looks and determines, is this leprosy, is it not leprosy? So because the Kohen has to see, from there they learn that a judge can't be a summa. And if you want to take this to a more conceptual framework, it's because if you can't see, right, it's hard to judge people without seeing their facial expressions, how they're saying what they're saying, right? It's harder to catch nuances that might be important for a judge to see. In Yevama, think of a completely different reason, which is a little bit more problematic from a modern eye, I would say. The Tannaitic Rav Yosef, but we'll talk about it also. Just like they have to be totally clean and righteous, from not, but they mean clean from righteousness means clean, that they're completely righteous. They also have to be completely without blemishes. Okay, and they quote a pasuk from Shir Shirim about how beautiful she is and there's no blemish. That's how the court has to be. The court has to look beautiful, right? Everyone has to be kind of in perfect shape without blemishes. It's a little bit difficult, like why should that matter? I wanted to come back to this because it's a concept we've talked about in the Mikdash as well. Things have to be perfect, right? Ein aniyut b'mkom hashirut, right? There can't be something that looks like poverty. We talked about this with the Kohen HaGadol also, right? The clothes always had to be beautiful, and everything had to be perfect, because what's the problem? And this is a bit of an issue. It's not really a good thing, I don't think, but the people, right? There's human nature, and the halach has to be concerned for human nature. And there's always a big concern. We learned this a lot with Zakeh Mamre, so I wanted to connect this to all sorts of things that we've learned in the past, which is they were always concerned, both in the temple, that people wouldn't accept kind of the service of the Kohanim or not enough, the glory. The glory of the temple is very important to create this concept that people, have reverence toward it. And the court also, there's always a concern that people are, right, we have this all the time nowadays, that people mock the court system, and people say, the courts, we don't believe in the courts. And if you don't believe in the courts, it kind of creates a big problem in society, which we're experiencing, presently. And it's hard to live, right? You can't create a system that people respect without, if people are going to point out issues all the time. And because people are humans, and not everybody, but some people say, a person's blind. They'll start saying, they don't really understand what they're talking about, even though it's not true. But people will say that. We have to be careful of that, and they made, right? So according, again, this is only one reason. There's two reasons for the other reason, right? But there is this reason that people are going to look at it and then have less respect for the court. So because of that, right, it has to be without any blemish, so that there's no room for anybody to start making claims against the court. Of course, in the end, people do anyway, but it's a way to kind of safeguard the system. Okay, so those are two different reasons as to why a blind person. But anyway, this is all learned out. Smicha miziknei ada. So that was all just to explain where we get that a blind person can't be a judge. So since it talks about judges, it uses smicha there, and it talks about smicha here, so we're going to assume it comes from there, and that's where we get a blind person. Chanamar, the other one, said smicha me'olat riyah. We're going to have a shava, although it's not really shava. We're going to see that later. But because there's smicha by olo riyah, and because there's smicha here now, olo riyah, or the olo brought by the people who come to the temple to see God. Okay, now it's the people, or if you're blind, you're exempt from olo riyah because you go to see God. Now, no one can really see God, but blind people are exempt from that because it talks about riyah there. So, because they're exempt from that, they'll be exempt from this. So now we're going to see. Okay, we don't really know where we get that there's smicha for olot riyah, so we'll talk about that soon. Right now, it sounds like there's a pasuk, but there isn't. Ulamanda amar. So now we're going to do the ping pong. If you say me'olat riyah, my time lo yalach miziknei ada, why aren't you going to learn from the Sanhedrin? Turning out amubet. Danim yachim yachib, ain't danim yachim yitzibur. Olot riyah is an obligation of the individual. And smicha of this kanim is something that's communal, right? That's the parhalim davar shel tzibur. It's a communal offering. So we'd rather learn it from individual offerings than learn it from communal offerings, because our case is an individual blind person who brings a korban. Does he have to do smicha, or does she have to do, well, not she, because she's exempt anyway, but do they have to do smicha or not? Ulemandi yalaf miziknei aidah. So the ones who learn from the Sanhedrin, then, why do they learn it, right? Again, it's from the Sanhedrin of this Kenim who do smicha in the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur case. So why wouldn't you learn it from Olat Riyah, especially if we just said that's individual, this is individual, why learn it from the Tzibur? Dani midi dichtiv be smicha begufe, midi dichtiv be smicha begufe. Lafuke Olat Riyah, dihi gufa me Olat nedava Gemara. We'd rather make Xera Shava to a pasuk where it actually appears than to a pasuk that doesn't appear. Meaning, in Olat Riyah, as I mentioned before, there is no smicha there. It never says smicha in Olat Riyah. It's learned out from the Olav and Nedava. We're going to see how indirect this whole thing is. Okay, so that's why we'd rather learn it from the Sanhedrin, where it specifically says Samchu Ziknei Aidah. So there's smicha in that pasuk. Much better to learn it from there than a pasuk of Olot Riyah, which smicha is never mentioned by Olot Riyah. So how do we know the one who learns it? Where did they get it from? Did Tana Kamed Rav Yitzchak Bar Abba? Tana brought Braita before of Yitzchak Bar Abba that said like this. This is a pasuk in the Miluim, in the Yom HaShmini that we just read last week. Vayakrev et ha'olah, vayaseh kamishpat. So they sacrificed the olah, and they did it according to its law. Now this is an olat chova. This is an obligatory korban olah, not the olat riyah. That's different. That was on the holidays. This was in the Miluim. But it's similar because they're both olot that are obligatory. So there it says that Aaron sacrificed the olah kamishpat, according to its law. What does that mean? Kimishpat olat nedava, the same way you do an ola that's a voluntary one. What do we learn from here? Limed al olat chova shetuna semicha. From here, what they learn, that the ola that's an obligatory ola needs semicha. Okay, so there you have it. It was derived from something else. So now we're going to derive this from something that was derived from somewhere else. That's already more distant, right, and less likely. And that's why he preferred the one who said, we're going to learn it from the Sanhedrin, better to learn it from there. Okay, now we're moving to the next part. Ha'eved v'shaliach v'aisha. And when we read the Mishnah, it sounds like, okay, and the way we understood for sure the women part, right, we're talking about a woman who brings her own sacrifice. She's not obligated to do smicha. Okay, it's even not clear, and this is again where Alana goes off, but it's not clear whether it means a woman can't or a woman's not obligated. That's always the problem. When a woman's excluded from a mitzvah, does it mean she can't do it or does it mean she's not obligated? But we understood again that it meant in Eved, let's say an Eved Knani brings his own korban, or a shaliach or a messenger, or a woman. Okay, so a messenger is bringing it in place of someone else. The other ones are doing it on their own. But now we're going to bring a braita that seems to understand these three cases as one category and different from the way the Mishnah understood it. Doesn't mean that our Mishnah should be read this way, but it does mean that the braita understood it this way. Tanu Rabanan, Yado. Okay, now we're going to have three psukim, okay, because every time it talks about smicha, what does it say? Samachat Yado. Okay, so the the owner puts his hand. Okay, so now, Yado. Now what does it say? His hand. What do we say from his hand? It comes to exclude Yado v'lo yad avdo, not his slaves. Yado v'lo yad shlucho, not his messengers. Yado v'lo yad ishto, not his wives. It's completely different. What's this saying? It's saying that the exemption of these three is you can't do it on behalf of someone else. You might have thought someone's slave can do it for them because the slave does all sorts of things for the owner, for the master. The wife, right? Wives and husbands do things for each other all the time. Right? And not only that, but halachically we say ishto kigufo. Your wife is like your body, which basically means sometimes there's things that one can do for the other. It's as if they did it for each other, right? And that it's as if the person... So here the wife is wife for the husband, not wife or not woman for her own sacrifice, but wife for her husband. Okay? So again, it's not the simple reading of the Mishnah, but definitely the Braita understands it this way. And same thing with the Eved. It's not the Eved bringing his own sacrifice. It's the Eved bringing the sacrifice of his master, wouldn't do smicha on it. Okay, and that's the point is, the owner has to do smicha on his own or her, his own korban, not hers because she's exempt, and not someone else on their behalf. Now, kol hanei lamali. Okay, why do we need three different miyutim to say really the same thing, which is, do smicha on your own korban, no one else can do it for you. So why do we need to say that in three different ways? Sricha. Okay, you need them each three, and I charted this out on the sheet if you want to look. If you just have one, meaning the first one, the Eved. Havamina lemiute Eved delav bar mitzvot. Well, Eved is easy to get out because they're not obligated in all the mitzvot. So we can get rid of the Eved. Maybe that's why the Eved can't. But a shaliach who's obligated in all mitzvot, maybe they could do it for you, right? A Jew. Aval shaliach de bar mitzvah, who, and not only is a shaliach a bar mitzvah, he's obligated in the same mitzvah as you are, ushlucho shel adam kimoto, and what do we say in general? We say a messenger doing something is as if you did it yourself. Again, this doesn't work for everything. You can't have someone, let's say, daven for you. I mean, theoretically you can if you're answering amen, but, you can't, like, there's certain things you have to do yourself, but shlucho shel adam kimoto, right? You can't say to someone, go to shul and daven for me, right? And I'll just sit in my house and do nothing. But there are many things that a shaliach can do. Ema l'smoch, maybe he could do smicha for you. No, that's why you need the second one. Okay, why do you need the third? Well, yeshmin and hane tarte, if you had those two, delav kegufei damya, because they're not like your own body. But avalishto tikegufei damya, because a woman is like the husband, they're like one unit. Ema tismoch, maybe she really could do it for him. Sricha, and that's why you need the psukim to tell you no. Also, she can't. Okay, now we're moving to the next section. Smicha she'arei mitzvah, which again means it's, right, she'arei literally means remainder. It means it's just not important. Okay, let me just stop for a second because I see your question, Tina, which is what if it's her own sacrifice? So the Braita seems to be focused more on the woman for her husband. However, the simple reading of the Mishnah and the way the Mishnah is read in general and the whole sugya that we saw about Nashim Samchot L'Shud, it's clear that it was understood by others as women are exempt. okay, even for their own sacrifices. So that's why I was very clear to say the Braita seems to have a different take than the Mishna does. But it seems clear that also she's not obligated for her own korbanot. Okay, just to make that clear. But then again, there's this whole sugya that women did do it and the rabbis let them. And that's a whole, like I said, a whole different sugya completely, which is, can they opt into mitzvot? Whether the rabbis accept it, didn't accept it. There's a whole sugya there that we learned. Okay, smicha sheirei mitzvah. So again, it's shirayim means remainder. It means it's like the remainder of a mitzvah. It's not so important. Tanu Rabbanan. So now they're going to use a braita, and this goes back to a pasuk I specifically highlighted before. V'samach v'nirtza. It says v'samach. He does smicha on the korban. V'nirtza lo lechaper alav. The next words in the same pasuk are, and the person receives atonement. It sounds like smicha gives you atonement. So they say v'chismicha machaperet. Smicha doesn't give you atonement. What do we know? We've been learning this, zvachim menachot for a long time. We know this. Halo ein kapar ala b'dam. The key part is the blood. How do we know? Shenemar ki adamu b'nefesh yechaper, because the blood is what atones. Ella, so why does it say that you're going to get kapara for this? Ella lomar lecha she'im asa'ah l'smicha she'yarei mitzvah. It's to say that if you treated, this is very fascinating. Smicha is sheyarei mitzvah, but if you treat them like a remainder of a mitzvah, and you just say, this isn't important, I'm just not going to do it. Ma'aleh alav katuv ki'ilu lo kipel. The Torah, meaning God, is going to treat you as if you didn't get atonement. The chiper, but of course you'll get atonement. In other words, it's telling you, do this so that you get atonement. You're not really going to get atonement from it, but if you don't do it, it's as if you are not going to get atonement. Because God is not going to be pleased with you that you just said, it's not an important part, so I just won't do it. And we're going to say the same thing. V'tanya gabei tnufa ki agavna. This is the first of our comparisons, although not the first. We've seen it before. The smicha and tnufa seem to be in a similar category. Tnufa is the waving, if you remember. We even had yesterday about the 3 korbanot with the 3 parameters. Tnufa before the animal slaughtered, tnufa after it's slaughtered, and smicha as if those 3 are a unit. So we're going to see some comparisons between smicha and tnufa. You're going to have the exact same thing about tnufa ki agavna. It says the same thing. And we're going to read this word for word, same thing about tnufa. The tnufa lechaper, it also says by tnufa. This is actually in the leper, which we're going to read in Shul Shabbos, that he brings an asham litnufa lechaper alav. Okay? He brings an asham for tnufa lechaper alav. So if you read the fact that tnufa is lechapel, you're going to get to the same conclusion. It's not the waving that provides the atonement, it's the blood. Same quoting the same pasuk. So again, it's going to say if you treated tnufa as if it wasn't important at all and didn't do it, it's as if you didn't get atonement, but in fact you will. It's just treated differently. Ala rosh. Now we're going to go through the other parts of the Mishna that we still have to deal with, which is you do smicha on the head. Where do we get this? So first of all, it says yado ala rosh, but how do you know you can't do it anywhere else? So we're going to do the same thing we did before. It's going to say ala rosh 3 times, yado ala rosh, okay? It says yado ala rosh, below yado ala tzavar, and not on the neck, okay? The first time it says it on the head, not on the neck. Yado ala rosh, below yado ala gabayim, and not on the back. Okay, back's plural. I don't know why they say back's plural, but not on the back. Yado ala rosh, v'lo yado ala chazeh, not on the chest. So now again, same thing we did before with the 3. Why do you need all 3? Can't you just say the head only? Kol hanei lamali. What do you need them all for? Tzricha. You need them why? Dikat brachmanacha lemute tzavar delo kai b'hadei rosho. The tzavar doesn't go in a line with the head. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what this means because you'll see the next thing is a little more confusing, but it sounds like the neck is lower than the head of the animal, so it's not standing up there with the rosh. Aval gabo dekai legabe lahade rosho emalo. This is a little confusing. The back does stand with the head. I'm not sure why. The neck actually is right of an animal. The back is also lower than the head, so I don't know exactly what they mean, but somehow they think that the neck is less significant, so maybe the neck no, but maybe the back would work. Tzricha, and that's why you need it. V'yesh min and hani trei. If you have both of those, you would say mishum delo etravi l'tnufa, because those things are never waved. But the chazeh, here's another comparison with tnufa and smicha. Chazeh di'itrabi l'tnufa. Remember the chest and the thigh, you wave them in the korban shlamim. So since you wave the chest, maybe you could also do smicha on the chest. So emalo, right? Maybe it's not a problem. Tzricha. That's why you need to say no. Smicha is not on the chest. Now we have 2 question, so we're going to have two easy answers on it. What if you put it on the sides of the face, like on the cheek? Not the head, but the sides of the face. Would that work? So we're going to see in a Braita clearly not. Tashma, Detanya Abi Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Yadol Osho v'lo yadol atzadim. His drasha was different, he said, and not on the sides of the face. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay, Rabbi Yirmiyah question, which usually we don't have answers to them. This one's going to have a pretty clear answer. Matlit ma'u shetachotz. Now you're supposed to put your hands on the head. What if there's a cloth on the head? Okay, like a handkerchief, and you put your hands on the handkerchief on the head. Is that okay? Obviously not, because we call that a cites, and your hands have to be on the head directly, and that's what we're going to say. Tashma, let's learn from here. Another Tannaitic source. You can't have anything separating between you and the zevach. Okay, we're going to end our sugya now with an interesting story, although we'll have one short thing after that. The next main part is about b'shtei yadayim. Where do we get two hands? Especially, I showed you all those psukim. Samachet yado, his hand. Where we get two hands. Sounds like just one hand. So we're going to have Rish Lakish. Menani milei amar Rish Lakish tamar kra v'samach Aharon et shtei yadav. When it comes to the seir mishtalech, which is very different than all the others, right? The scapegoat. So Aaron puts his two hands, it says in the pasuk, shtei yadav. But there's something strange about that pasuk. Shtei yadav is written, yadav in Hebrew is written yud dalid yud vav. That yadav is written yud dalid vav as if yado, singular. So comes Rish Lakish and he says, ktiv yado, uchtiv shtei. Right? It says yado, but it's obviously yadav because it says two. So two yado, it's very right. Two, one hand. It doesn't make any sense. So it's obviously two hands, but why is it written like that? Zeh bana'av. This taught you that kol makom shneimar yado harei kan shtayim. Every time it says yado in the Torah, it means two. Okay? Ad shifro l'cha k'tuv echad, until it says one. If it doesn't say yad echad, then it's two. Okay? Yado is two. So what happens now? Also, Rabbi Elazar was the student of Rabbi Yochanan, who was the friend of Rish Lakish, right, the Chavruta. So Rabbi Elazar comes into the Beit Midrash. Amalei lahashmata Beit Midrash. He says what Rish Lakish said in the Beit Midrash. Sounds great, but huge error. What did he do? Lo amrei mishmei Rish Lakish. He didn't say it in the name of Rish Lakish. Big problem. Shama Rish Lakish ve'ikpi. Rish Lakish got very angry that he didn't say it in his name. Amarle, he says to him, Isal Kadat. So what does Rish Lakish do? He says, I'm going to embarrass him. So what does he do? He gets up in the middle of the Beit Midrash. He says, I have a question on your theory, which is kind of funny because it was Rish Lakish's theory. So he throws a question at Rabbi Elazar and says, Isal Kadat, yado tartin. If you think everything it says yado, it's two, then the Torah would never need to say yadav. Okay? Lama li l'michtav yadav, yadav. Why would you need to say yadav, yadav in this place? Ikshale eslim ba'arba yadav. He throws it in 24 mentions of the word yadav in the Torah. It would never need to say yadav. You could just always say yado if yado always meant two. Yadav tivi'enu, yadav ravlo, sikelet yadav. He quotes from a bunch of psukim. They didn't bring all 24 here. Ishtik. Rabbi Elazar was silent. He had nothing to answer. Lebatar dinach nafshei. After Rish Lakish calmed down from his anger subsided, Amarle says to Rabbi Elazar, my time lo temali, why don't you answer me? You have a good answer. Kind of like Rish Lakish knew the answer, okay? He had the answer to his own question. He said, why don't you say to me, Yadav de smicha ka'amre? I was talking in the context of smicha. You could have said that. I meant every time it says Yadav in the context of smicha, Yado, in the context of smicha means two, not all these other 24 psukim which had nothing to do with smicha. So, kind of now even more embarrassing, Rabbi Elazar, because like you could have had an answer. So Rabbi Elazar has an answer. He says, "B'smicha nami k'tiv." What do you mean? And he catches up Rabbi Lakish. He says, by smicha, it also says, and I see someone wrote it in the chat, by yismocha yadav alav yitzaveh, when Moshe does smicha on the head of Yoshua to pass on, right, a different kind of smicha, but also putting his hands on Yoshua, it says yadav. That's by smicha, and it says it in plural. Why? So Rabbi Elazar throws that back at Rish Lakish, to which Rish Lakish answers, smicha de behema kamre. I was talking about smicha of an animal. In other words, all these mentions, samachet yado, samachet yado, samachet yado. In all these places, that's what I meant, just there. And it's only in those places, and therefore none of these are really questions, even though I threw them at you as questions, but you didn't really understand. And, it kind of teaches you about misquoting someone. If you're going to quote someone, at least quote them in their name, and then people at least could check with them. What did they mean by what they said, right? It's very dangerous. Besides the whole idea of bringing Geula Olam by quoting B'Shem Omro, right? Giving credit where credit is due. Okay, ending with this last part. Why are we saying this? Because obviously if you do the smicha in the place where the shchita is, or you if you have to do, more like this, if you have to do the shechita immediately after smicha, then obviously you're going to be in the place where it is. So why does it say it as if they're two separate things? This is how you should read it. The reason why you do smicha in the place where you do shechita is because you have to immediately do shechita right after smicha. Okay, and with that we end this Mishna. We'll start with the next Mishna in tomorrow's daf. So what do we have? We learned about the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about yoresh somech or not somech. With that, we got to a bunch of different understandings of how to darshan the korbanot 3 times and what each one's coming to limit. Then what does each one do with the pasuk of the other, and how we learn from smicha to temura or temura to smicha. And then we got to who does smicha, how is smicha done, right? We got to all the exemptions and where the exemptions are learned from. Then we got to smicha is shayrei mitzvah, where we get that from, and doesn't it say it provides atonement? Well, not really, but sort of yes, sort of not, right? It's as if you don't get atonement if you don't do it, but you really do. And then how, right, on the head and not in other, not other possibilities, and how we got 2 hands, and even though it says yado in most places, and that's all learned from the smicha that Aaron did on the siyar mishtalech, and the way it's written, and that led Rish Lakish's Rasha, which Rabbi Elazar tried to quote, but got kind of stuck on it with all of Rabbi Rish Lakish's questions. And then we just ended with the Tech of the Smicha Shchitesh. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a meaningful Yom HaShoah, and be a quiet day.